On a warm spring evening in 2014, a long-distance train rolled slowly across the desert tracks between Cairo and Alexandria. Among its passengers sat a quiet, unremarkable man traveling under a false Sudan identity. No one suspected that multiple intelligence agencies were tracking his every move. His real name was Farhan Talib, a senior Hamas operational coordinator known in Covert circles as the man who could move weapons, money, and messages across borders without ever being seen. He was fluent in shadows, a master of disappearing until this journey. As the train rattled through the darkness, the air was thick with diesel fumes and quiet murmurs from sleeping passengers. Somewhere in one of the cars, a team of trained observers blended into the ordinary crowd, each of them waiting for a single silent signal. They were part of a covert Israeli operation carefully planned for months. The mission was not to arrest, not to negotiate, but to eliminate. The instructions were precise. No gunfire, no attention, no witnesses who could understand what happened. The perfect operation leaves no story, only absence. Farhan believed Egypt was neutral ground, a place where borders blurred and eyes looked away. But espionage has long memories and longer reach. The past has a way of stepping quietly back into one's life, especially when one is trapped inside a moving train. At exactly 1:14 a.m., somewhere between two quiet stations, the plan moved. A door opened. Distraction was staged. A presence vanished. The operation took less than 40 seconds. A lifetime compressed into silence. When the train arrived at its next stop, Farhan did not step out. He was already gone. A ghost swallowed by the machinery of covert war. Stories like this draw you in, where real-world espionage unfolds in silence. Where nations wage wars in the shadows rather than on battlefields, then you're in the right place. These events are real. The stakes are real, and the world they reveal is rarely shown to the public. Before we go deeper, tell me where you're watching from. Your city, your country. It helps us understand our global audience of curious minds. And if you haven't already, like this video, leave a comment and subscribe because the next story might be even darker. To understand what happened on that train, we must first understand the man at the center of it, Farhan Talib. He was not a commander in uniform, nor a public figure delivering speeches. He was a ghost in the network, a broker in the underground channels connecting Gaza, Sinai, and beyond. He managed funding routes, travel documents, encrypted communications, and the discreet movement of people who were never meant to be traced. In a world where information is power, he was a gatekeeper. But Farhan did not rise from privilege or prestige. He came from narrow alleyways, crowded rooms, and a childhood shaped by conflict. To him, resistance was not ideology. It was inheritance. The fight was not theoretical. It was personal. Over years, he built alliances with smugglers, tribal intermediaries, diplomats who whispered instead of signing papers, and factions who trusted no one except those who could make things happen quietly. This made him valuable. This made him dangerous, and this made him a priority target. On the other side of the struggle, Mossad had been tracking the quiet architecture of support networks rather than the fighters with flags. They understood that wars are not won by removing the visible, but by cutting the invisible. Connections that keep movements alive. Farhan wasn't just a man. He was a link in a chain they needed to break. So the question becomes, how far can a state go to eliminate a threat that never shows itself? And when the battlefield is everywhere and nowhere, what counts as a line that must not be crossed? To answer that, we must step back into the political world that shaped both the hunter and the target. The pursuit of Farhan Talib did not begin in a vacuum. It unfolded in a Middle East defined by shifting alliances, covert agendas, and decades of unresolved conflict. At this time, Egypt occupied a tense middle position, neither fully aligned with Hamas nor openly cooperative with Israel, yet influenced by regional negotiation pressures and internal security concerns. The Sinai Peninsula with its deserts and shadow routes became a silent corridor where factions, smugglers, and intelligence services orbited around each other without acknowledgement. Israel, for its part, viewed Hamas not simply as an opposing force but as an evolving organization capable of merging political messaging with covert military logistics. The Israeli intelligence community believed that the most dangerous figures were not the ones issuing public statements, but the ones who ensured money, weapons, and movement continued uninterrupted behind the scenes. This is where operated not at the front but beneath the foundation. Meanwhile, Gaza was under heavy strain. Borders were tightly controlled. Resources were scarce. Every movement required networks, personal, tribal, ideological, and economic. Figures like Farron thrived in environments where survival required negotiation more than command. They became bridges between territories, communities, and factions that often distrusted each other. The very instability that burdened the region also empowered those who understood how to navigate its edges. At the same time, Egypt's internal politics were shifting. Security forces were on high alert for extremist spillover from Sinai. Intelligence agencies operated quietly to maintain balance and avoid drawing attention to any foreign partnerships, formal or informal. The goal was stability, or at least the appearance of it. But within this balancing act, gaps formed. Discrete spaces where covert actors could maneuver. Across these environments, intelligence became the real battlefield. Satellites, informants, encrypted messages, border checkpoints, and personal relationships all carried weight. Every faction watched the others even when pretending not to. Every decision left a trace, even when made in silence. This is where the hunt for Farron took shape. Not through open strikes, but through patient mapping of patterns. Who he met, where he traveled, how he moved information, who carried his messages when he could not appear. For Mossad, eliminating someone like Farron was not just about one person. It was about interrupting flow, stopping communication pathways, supply networks, and strategic planning links that allowed operations to survive even under isolation. Yet, the ethics of such an operation were complex. A targeted later. At a 111, a staged commotion unfolded 2 cars ahead. A dropped bag. A raised voice, the sudden clatter of a tin that rolled into the aisle. Heads turned. A conductor muttered. Footsteps approached. The distraction was not meant to alarm, only to reorient attention, to create a current in which a small movement would go unnoticed. People craned to see what had happened and then shrugged their shoulders, returning to the private business of travel. At 0113, the operative seated behind Fawn shifted. It was a movement so slight it could have been mistaken for sleep. He stood, collected his bag, and moved toward the vestibule as if seeking the restroom. He passed close enough for a brief, almost accidental brush against Farah's coat. A nudge, a smell of tobacco, a whisper of breath. In that brush, a subtle change occurred. Farron's posture loosened. The line of his defenses thinned. The final moment lasted less than a minute. The man who had boarded 2 stops earlier, the one now standing, made his way back slowly, hands folded, eyes on the floor. He paused beside Farron, offering the practiced courtesy of helping with a satchel. No sudden gestures, no raised voices, a quiet exchange, a brief hesitation as though apologizing for an accidental touch. Then Farron slumped, his head tipped forward like a candle guttering. For a fragment, the carriage registered nothing but the soft ripple of fabric and the distant clack of wheels. Someone pronounced a name they did not know. Someone asked if he was all right. The porter rose, fingers fumbling for a pulse. The soldier blinked awake. A woman called for water. The train's ordinary humanitarian instincts kicked in. Hands that wanted to help, voices that wanted explanation. The operatives melted into the scene as seamlessly as they had entered it. One spoke to the conductor in low tones. Another produced a mobile number from a wallet and claimed to be a relative, voice steady and comforting. They steered attention toward the narrative of an ordinary medical emergency. Exhaustion, dehydration, and unnoticed heart attack. Fewer questions, less suspicion. People lowered their voices to a polite murmur. The train carried on. At 0118, the carriage crew made the clinical declaration that turned curiosity into protocol. The sleeping man would be checked by medical staff. When the train reached the next station, by the time the brakes whispered their arrival, the operatives had already dispersed. One stepping off before the doors opened, another lingering to help load luggage, a third adjusting his cap, and leaving in the flow of passengers. Where they had sat, there was now only the trace of a coat and the quiet of a life interrupted. Outside, the desert swallowed the train's light. Inside, passengers exchanged shocked glances, offered condolences, and reached for phones to call home. The story that would be told, that this was a collapsed traveler taken by fate, fit easily into the ordinary fears of long distance trips. The operatives had not created a spectacle. They had produced an absence wrapped in the language of chance. By dawn, when files and faces were checked in CCTV, from distant stations was reviewed, the line of evidence led nowhere decisive. Man had died on a train. No weapons were found. No clear motive announced itself. The incident fit the patterns the planners had predicted. A moment that looked like misfortune, not malice for those who had carried out the operation. The result read as mission accomplished. The network link had been severed. The flow of messages and money that depended on that link would feel the disruption. For others, the disappearance became another headline in a long series of losses and mysteries. For fans' allies, suspicion and grief replaced certainty. The carriage returned to its routine, whispered prayers, the rustle of newspapers, the soft thrum of a train that had once again become merely a method of transport. Outside, the desert kept its secrets. Inside, lives continued, unaware how close they had come to being the stage of a quiet, consequential act. When the train finally arrived at the station, the announcement was clinical and unremarkable. One passenger requires medical attention. There was no alarm, no urgency. The staff moved with the weary professionalism of those who have seen travelers collapse from heat, exhaustion, or long hours. An ambulance arrived quietly. No sirens, no crowd. The passengers, still half asleep from the journey, stepped aside respectfully. Most simply assumed it was fate. But news does not stay still, especially in a region where every unexplained death carries the weight of possibility. By mid-morning, rumors had already begun to circulate. Some whispered that the man had been poisoned. Others claimed he suffered from an illness. One story said he had been carrying diplomatic papers. Another said he was an ordinary laborer. Truth dissolved into speculation as it often does when silence is the official answer. Inside Gaza, the reaction was immediate, not public, not announced, but felt. Messages moved quietly across internal networks. Names were confirmed. Acknowledgements were exchanged. The realization was sharp and heavy. A key coordinator had disappeared. Not in a raid, not in a confrontation, but in a silent, controlled event beyond their territory. Among those who had worked with Fond, the shock was personal. He had been the bridge, the one who negotiated when negotiations were impossible. His absence was not just emotional, it was structural. Roots would have to be rearranged, trust relationships reconsidered, and the unspoken question hung over everyone who had ever traveled with caution. If he could be reached, who couldn't? In Israel's intelligence circles, the reaction was markedly different. The operation was measured against its objectives. No civilian casualties, no diplomatic fallout, no visible trail connecting the event to external actors. Reports were brief, concise, and unemotional. The mission was considered clean. Files were updated. Channels were closed. The operatives who had participated faded back into ordinary life, their involvement becoming just another classified entry in a secure archive. Egypt's official reaction was quieter still. The government issued no statement. The incident was recorded as a medical fatality. It was more convenient that way. Acknowledging foreign involvement would raise questions, and questions would require answers no institution wished to give. In a region where stability is often maintained by silence, not speaking can be the most deliberate policy. However, in private security circles across Cairo, whispers moved in low tones. Someone had crossed Egyptian territory. Someone had executed a controlled kill, and it had been done with precision. Some officers admired the operation's elegance. Others resented the violation of sovereignty, but most simply understood it as part of a game older than their careers. No protest was filed, no accusations were made, just a quiet tightening of observation, a few internal memos, and the knowledge that the invisible war had shifted again. The world did not pause. Trains continued running. Markets opened, streets filled with morning noise. But in the circles where silence holds meaning, the message was clear. A line had been crossed, not loudly, not violently, but unmistakably. As time passed, the story of what happened to Farhan Talib did not settle into one version. Instead, it fractured into competing narratives, each shaped by political needs, ideological loyalties, and the natural secrecy of intelligence operations. In the world of covert actions, the truth is rarely a single line. It is a layered shape shifting depending on who is looking. The first version, the one written into the official paperwork, was simple and almost mundane. Farhan suffered a sudden medical failure while traveling. A tragic coincidence, nothing more. The report listed no signs of struggle, no external marks, no obvious. "'Cause, a quiet death in transit, something that happens to travelers more often than anyone realizes." This version was convenient. It required no investigation, no diplomatic questions, and no uncomfortable explanations. For many it was enough, but in private few believed it. Among Farron's circle, the second version gained traction that he had been poisoned not with something dramatic or theatrical but with a substance designed to mirror natural failure. A compound that dissipates quickly, leaving no trace by the time medical personnel begin their routine checks. They believed the careful timing was intentional, the execution precise. To them, the clean nature of the death was the evidence. The quiet was too quiet, the sequence too controlled. A third interpretation emerged among independent analysts and former security figures across the region, that the operation was not purely Mossad but jointly facilitated by silent cooperation on the ground. Not an alliance in writing but a coincidence of interests. After all, intelligence services do not always acknowledge each other, but they do observe one another. Sometimes the removal of a problematic mediator benefits more than one side, even if no one admits it. In this version, subtle agreements existed, not spoken aloud, not signed, but understood. A nod of permission, a deliberate blind spot, a door quietly left unlocked. Then came the fourth version, whispered by those who follow internal dynamics rather than international ones. They suggested that Farron's death may not have been solely the work of an external enemy but potentially aided by a betrayal within the network he served. Power struggles exist everywhere, even in resistance movements. Influence shifts, trust erodus. A figure who knows too much or holds too many keys can become a threat even to allies. In this theory, the death was both elimination and replacement, clearing a path for someone more aligned with internal shifts. No version fully disproved the others. No version fully explained the details. Each held fragments of plausibility. What complicates the narrative further is the nature of train environments. They are transient spaces. People come and go. Faces blur. Memories blend. Witnesses recall shapes, gestures, clothing but rarely certainty. And the absence of violence made the event feel ordinary. Many passengers remembered it only as a tired traveler collapsing. Memory itself became unreliable. Years later, questions continued to surface. Was the operation a statement or simply strategy? Was sovereignty violated or was it quietly permitted? Was the silence following the event intentional diplomacy or a form of denial? And the most persistent question of all, if an assassination leaves no trace, does it become history or myth? The truth, if written anywhere, lies sealed within classified archives that will not open for decades, if ever. By then, the people who planned the operation will have disappeared into retirement, and those who were affected will have long lived with its consequences. In the shadows where intelligent stories exist, certainty is a luxury. What remains is a tapestry of belief, suspicion, and quiet acknowledgement that something deliberate happened and it was meant to be forgotten. The death of Talib did not cause explosions, protests, or immediate public outrage. It unfolded in silence, and its consequences unfolded the same way. But silence is not emptiness. Silence is pressure. Is the shifting of weight beneath the surface. The kind that changes balance without drawing attention. For Israel, the operation was viewed as a tactical success. A key connector in a discrete logistics network had been removed. Not a loud figure, not a symbol, but a node. Removing a node has consequences. Networks depend on trust, habit, rhythm. When a crucial intermediary disappears, routines falter, messages slow, transfers delay. People who once felt confident must now look over their shoulders and ask questions they never had to ask before. Who else is being watched? Who else might be next? The loss of FAN forced Hamas and its extended logistical partners to restructure their covert pathways. Trusted couriers were re-evaluated. Travel patterns changed overnight. Funds moved less fluidly. Where once there was certainty, now there was hesitation. And hesitation in this kind of struggle is weakness. Not on the battlefield, but in the quiet strategic space where battles are shaped. But the result was not a total strategic victory. Removing a single figure, even a critical one, does not dismantle an entire system. Networks adapt. They regrow. Sometimes more cautiously, sometimes more effectively. Over the following months, new intermediaries emerged. Some more careful, some more aggressive. The chain was disrupted but not severed. Egypt, meanwhile, faced a different impact. The operation, though unspoken, signaled that its territory could be used as a stage without acknowledgement. Even if Cairo publicly ignored the event, internally it recognized a violation of control. Sovereignty is not only about borders, it is about who gets to act without permission. Though no accusation was made, the memory remained, influencing future calculations, negotiations, and surveillance patterns across Sinai and the urban corridors leading from it. The international consequences remained subtle but present. Intelligence agencies across the region took note. The message was not verbal. It was demonstrated. If a threat exists outside home territory, it is still reachable. This kind of message changes behavior. It creates caution. It encourages paranoia. It forces networks to adopt new measures, some more effective, others more destructive. For Hamas, the psychological cost may have been greater than the operational one. The idea that one of their most careful, disciplined, and cautious operatives could be reached on neutral ground without warning, without confrontation, planted a sense of vulnerability. Not the overt vulnerability of military pressure, but the quiet internal vulnerability that shapes trust and planning. Yet strategically, no side gained a final advantage. The conflict remained. The networks adapted. The intelligence agencies continued to watch one another in mirrors and shadows. In the chessboard of the Middle East, this operation did not end a game. It was a one piece removed, one formation disrupted, one signal sent, and all sides adjusted accordingly. What changed most was perception. The understanding that power can be exercised quietly, precisely, and invisibly, that borders matter less than the ability to move through them unseen, and that in the silent war victory is not a flag. It is the ability to act without being acknowledged. Today the event exists in a strange space between memory and myth. There are no commemorative plaques, no confirmed files, no official announcements. And yet, in intelligence circles, the train operation is spoken of quietly as an example of what modern covert action looks like when executed without error. For some, the operation is studied as a model of precision, a demonstration that power does not always announce itself with noise. It shows how control can be exercised through timing, silence, and patience. No gunfire, no chaos, no traceable conflict. A single life removed to shift an entire network's balance. For others, however, it remains deeply controversial. The operation blurred lines that are already delicate in a region layered with history and grievances. A targeted killing carried out inside another nation's territory without acknowledgement raises questions of sovereignty, legality, and what nations choose to define as security. To some commentators, the act was strategic necessity. To others, it was a violation, a message that borders offer no protection, that the quiet spaces between nations can be manipulated by unseen hands. Within Palestinian circles, Farhan Talib has taken on a more symbolic legacy. Not a public martyr or a broadcast hero, but a reminder that the battlefield is everywhere. In border lanes, in phone signals, in identity documents, in unguarded moments. This story circulates not as spectacle, but as warning. Over time, artistic works, private manuscripts, and whispered conversations have emerged around the event. None claim certainty. Version is tinted with perspective. A tragedy, a lesson, a violation, a demonstration of will. Meanwhile, military MIs and covert training programs reference the case not by name, but by method. They study the invisibility of the operatives, the psychological shaping of the environment, the way a public setting can be reshaped into a controlled space. No operational handbook describes the mission directly, but the principles are present in lectures and scenario training. The legacy of the event is not loud. It is quiet, steady, unresolved. It forces ongoing questions. Can any nation justify acting beyond its borders when pursuing perceived threats? When security is defined by silence, who holds accountability? And how much of what shapes history is never recorded at all? The controversy is not just about what was done. It is about the world that allows it. A world where power is proven, not through battles but through what cannot be traced. In the end, the story of Farhan Talib is not just about one man, one train, or one operation. It is a reflection of the silent shape of modern conflict. A world where battles are no longer defined by armies clashing, but by decisions made in rooms without windows, by signatures that never appear on paper, and by actions carried out without acknowledgement. The operation achieved its immediate purpose. A link was severed. A network slowed. A message was delivered in silence. But the deeper consequences live on. Every targeted act in the shadows creates aftershocks. A tightening of suspicion, a recalibration of trust, a shift in how threats and lives are valued. The question that lingers is not whether the mission succeeded. It did. The question is what it cost, not in resources but in the shape of the world it reinforced. Because when a nation decides that its safety permits reaching into foreign territory in the dead of night without acknowledgement or accountability, the meaning of sovereignty changes. When movements learn that no ground is neutral, the meaning of refuge changes. When individuals learn that caution offers no guarantee, the meaning of safety changes. We are left with a paradox. Can a nation defend itself without expanding the boundaries of its reach? And equally, can a people resist without accepting that every connection may one day be targeted? This story reminds us that modern power is invisible and that the most decisive events are the ones no one is meant to witness. But even the quietest story leaves echoes. The train kept moving. The passengers woke the next morning and the world turned forward, unchanged on the surface but altered underneath the shadows. However, remember, if this story pulled you in, if you want to explore more hidden histories, covert operations, and untold geopolitical events, subscribe and turn on the bell. There are many more stories still buried in the silence, and we are just getting started. Killing in a foreign sovereign state, especially one conducted without acknowledgement, risked diplomatic consequences. It blurred the line between national security and covert intrusion. It forced the question, when does defense become interference? But in the silent corridors of intelligence work, such questions rarely halted decision-making. They became footnotes discussed long after the operation was done, when the consequences were already in motion. But the time Farron boarded that train, the world around him had already made its calculations. The alliances had formed. The files had been compiled. The signal lines had been monitored. And somewhere far away, a decision had already been signed. The train was simply the final chapter of a story that began years earlier in a region where history writes itself through unsaid choices and unseen hands. The decision to target Farron Talib was not made impulsively. Inside a secure wing of Israel's intelligence headquarters, a small group of analysts, field officers, and senior planners gathered around a quiet directive: identify, isolate, and remove a network architect who was never meant to be seen. The operation was initiated not because Fan led attacks directly, but because he linked people who could act. Removing him meant weakening entire chains of action. The first step was to map his movements. Farron rarely used phones. He avoided digital communication. But people, even the most careful ones, leave patterns. Investigators studied travel flows between Gaza, Sinai, and Cairo. They charted who met whom, not once, but repeatedly. They watched border crossings, medical travel permits, informal courier routes, and the tribal brokers who controlled access across desert paths. Slowly, a picture developed. Faint at first, but unmistakable. Farron used Egypt as a quiet transit zone. His greatest defense was his invisibility. So, Mossad's strategy became simple. Do not search for him. Search for the spaces he must pass through. To move from Gaza deeper into the region, Farron needed documentation. Not real passports but identities. Borrowed, traded, or constructed. Mossad operatives quietly inserted questions into places where documents were processed. Not arrests, not accusations. Just notice. Watch. When a name reappears in two unrelated places, when a face travels through a checkpoint at a time that coincides with someone else's disappearance, that is where a threat appears. Once they isolated the alias Farron planned to use, the operation shifted to logistics. The assassination could not occur in Gaza. Too risky. Not in Sinai. Too visible. Not in Cairo. Too politically sensitive. But somewhere between cities, in a place where noise would be ordinary and movement expected. A train was perfect. A train is a world in motion. No cameras reliable enough to track every second. No fixed witnesses, no stationary crime scene, just movement, transitions, and anonymity. The team deployed into Egypt months before the operation under layers of non-intersecting cover identities. Some entered as business travelers, some as university exchange visitors, some as NGO personnel. They did not know each other and they never met directly. Their communication ran through dead drops. coded phrases and silent recognition markers designed to avoid patterns. 1. Group focused on observing train schedules, passenger habits, security presence, and timing of nighttime travel. Another group focused on learning foreign travel comfort zones, where he sat, how he positioned himself. In crowds, how he reacted to strangers who came too close. They were not studying his strength, they were studying his predictability. The final structure of the operation required precision without disruption. No gunfire, no alarms, no confrontation. The objective was to make the event indistinguishable from ordinary movement. A passenger boards, a passenger leaves, no one remembers the face, no one remembers the moment. Just another traveler. On the night of the operation, everything depended on timing. A field operative boarded the train 2 stops before Fan. Another boarded 1 stop after. Others blended among travelers. A woman reading quietly. Man pretending to sleep. A porter with a bag that was not his. Each knew only their own fragment of the plan. They did not speak. They did not look at each other. They did not acknowledge the mission itself. The operation did not require force. It required closeness, the ability to be within an arm's reach. Without becoming a memory, the act would be silent, instantaneous and irreversible, designed to mimic collapse, exhaustion, or an undetected medical failure. Everything was set. Hours of preparation for seconds of action. No second attempt. No recovery, if exposed. As the train rolled into the deep desert night, all that remained was the signal. A subtle cue known only to the final operative, triggered not by command but by opportunity. The moving train would become a theater where everything changed quietly, efficiently, and without leaving fingerprints. January's night pressed close to the rails, a dry hush broken only by the steady clack of wheels and the soft sigh of air brakes. Inside the carriage, the lights were dimmed to a tired glow. Most passengers slept folded against their bags or stared into phone screens that offered small private horizons. The train moved like a creature breathing, deliberate, indifferent to the lives it carried. Outside, the desert was a black smear. Inside, 1,000 small human rhythms continued. A child's restless kicking, the scrape of a tin cup, a woman turning a page. At 01022, operatives took their positions. One sat 2 rows ahead of the man traveling under the pseudonym alias. Another sat 2 rows behind. A third pretended to sleep in the opposite aisle. A fourth stood near the vestibule pretending to stretch. They were ordinary people in ordinary places. An exhausted commuter, a nocturnal buyer, a porter, a student. With a paper map. Their eyes avoided each other. Their breathing matched the carriage's slow rhythm. Farron, unaware that he had become a point on someone else's map, moved with the weary caution of someone who has always inhabited margins. He chose a window seat, wrapped his coat tighter against a draft, and folded his hands over a small battered satchel. He checked his watch, a practiced motion, then allowed his eyelids a moment's respite. He had done this before. Travel. Transfers, the invisible choreography of a life that must not be obvious. At 0108, the train crossed an empty stretch, where mobile reception thinned and the line of sight to any station turned to memory. The carriage hummed with privacy. The operatives tightened their focus into that narrow span where anonymity could be used as cover instead of concealment. No one spoke. The plan's heartbeat was the rhythm of the train. Each agent monitored the nearest witness, a vendor by the door, a family in the corner, the single soldier dozing with his rifle cradled. They cataloged breathing patterns and small gestures, a cough, a shiver, the way someone turned the page. Such things reveal more about a scene than a dozen reports filed.